It was my first day as a guard on a special program that was supposed to check out an unoccupied prison before it was demolished. I had heard stories about the place, things that happened there when it was still in operation, but nothing extraordinary, just the kind of stories you hear about any old prison. Mostly about fights and things like that. I never thought about any of that when I took the job. I just needed the money. We arrived early before dawn. The prison was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields that had once been cultivated, but were now overgrown with weeds. The watchtowers stood silent, their windows broken. Everything was quiet, too quiet, which made the place seem even more frightening. My job was simple. Walk around the cell blocks with my flashlight, making sure there were no vagrants or animals that had taken the place as shelter. First, everything seemed normal. The cell doors were open, and the light from my flashlight glided over graffiti-strewn walls and remnants of what had been life there. But as I went along, the atmosphere began to change. The air felt heavier, as if something was compressing my chest. I began to hear noises, sounds that couldn't be just the wind. They were knocks, footsteps, always in the distance, always around the next corner. Every time I turned, there was nothing, but the sound always seemed to be just behind the next door or at the end of the next hallway. I decided to enter the maximum security area, where the most dangerous inmates had been locked up. It was a separate building, connected to the rest of the prison by a long, dark corridor. As I entered, the sound of my own footsteps bounced off the walls, making me jump every time I heard the echo behind me. At the end of one of the corridors, I found a series of cells that looked different. The doors were locked, unlike the others I had checked. There was something written on the door of one cell, in large, crooked letters, "Do not open." Of course, that only piqued my curiosity. I walked over and put my hand on the cold metal door. I decided to ignore the warning. With my heart pounding in my chest, I pulled out the keys I had been given and found the one that seemed to fit. The door squeaked as I turned the key and slowly pushed it in. What I saw inside almost made me recoil. The cell was empty, of course, but the walls were covered in scratches and marks that looked like they were made in desperation, almost as if someone had tried to escape with their bare hands. The floor was covered with crumpled papers and small figures made of what appeared to be torn clothes and pieces of sheets. At the back of the cell, in the corner, was something I hadn't expected. A small pile of rodent bones, stacked meticulously, almost like an altar. I felt a shiver run down my back. Who had been here? What had he been doing? And why did I feel this pressure in my chest? More and more intense, as if something or someone was now beside me. I left the cell, closing the door behind me. The sound of the door closing echoed in the silent hallway, and for a moment, everything was even quieter. I couldn't take my eyes off the door, almost expecting something to push it from inside. But nothing did. I forced myself to keep going, to continue on my rounds, trying to ignore the fear growing inside me. The corridors seemed narrower now, the shadows darker. The noises had ceased, and somehow that was even worse. The silence was deafening, as if the entire prison was holding its breath, waiting. Each cell I passed seemed exactly the same as the last until I reached the end of the block, where the door to the last cell was ajar. As I approached, the smell hit me first. It was a rotten smell, of things that should have been cleaned long ago but had been left there to decay. With flashlight in hand, I shone the light inside the cell. What I saw inside chilled me. On the floor, scattered throughout the cell, were the remains of what appeared to be prison uniforms. But they were torn, stained with something dark that I didn't want to admit was blood. And among those remains, more bones. But these were not those of rodents. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I tried to process the scene. My mind screamed for me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Then, I heard a noise behind me. A thud, like the sound of something heavy dragging on the ground. I turned slowly, the light of the flashlight cutting through the darkness like a knife. There, crawling toward me from the corridor, was a figure. It couldn't be human, not with the way it moved, with its limbs twisted and crawling unnaturally. Its eyes, however, glowed with a disturbing intelligence. Its mouth was open in a grimace, and I could see that the teeth were sharp, too sharp. I don't remember screaming, but I must have because my throat was hoarse. I backed away instinctively, stumbling against the cell door as the creature continued to advance. In an act of pure instinct, I slammed the door shut and turned the key, locking it inside. The sound of something banging on the door from inside echoed down the hallway. I ran. I didn't look back, not until I was outside that building, under the sunlight that was beginning to rise on the horizon. My lungs burned, my body trembled, but I didn't stop until I reached the car. I started the engine and sped away from that prison, vowing never to return. To this day, I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was the product of some horrible experimentation or just something the prison had hidden, something that had survived by feeding on what it could find. I only know that it was not a hallucination, and that I will never, ever forget the eyes of that creature, nor the sound of its teeth clashing as it tried to reach me.